Did you know the king of rock and roll faced brutal criticism? Could Elvis Presley actually have released music that critics despised? Was the cultural icon sometimes considered a musical failure? Elvis Presley changed music forever, but not everyone was impressed with every record he released. Though now considered one of the most influential artists of all time, Elvis faced harsh criticism throughout his career. Critics often questioned his artistic choices, especially as musical trends evolved and Elvis attempted to adapt. Some of his now legendary recordings were initially met with confusion, disappointment, or outright disdain. Let's take a look at 12 Elvis recordings that critics absolutely hated when they were first released. Number 12, Suspicious Minds, 1969. You might find it hard to believe, but Suspicious Minds wasn't an immediate hit with critics. The song, now considered one of Elvis's greatest comeback singles, faced skepticism upon its release. Critics questioned whether Elvis could successfully return to form after years focused on movie soundtracks. Rolling Stone called it a desperate attempt at relevance, while other publications suggested Elvis was trying too hard to compete with newer artists like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. The dramatic arrangement and emotional delivery that fans now adore were initially described as overwrought and melodramatic by several music journalists. Despite this early criticism, Suspicious Minds eventually reached number 1 on the charts and is now regarded as one of Elvis's signature songs. The critics who initially dismissed it would later eat their words as the song became a staple of Elvis's live performances and a fan favorite. Number 11, In the Ghetto, 1969. Did Elvis have any business singing about social issues? That's what critics wondered when In the Ghetto was released. This socially conscious song about poverty and the cycle of violence in inner cities was a major departure for Elvis. Music critics were brutal, calling it preachy, inauthentic, and exploitative. The New York Times described it as a white man's uncomfortable appropriation of black suffering. Others accused Elvis of trying to cash in on the socially conscious folk movement that was popular at the time. Mac Davis, who wrote the song later, revealed that many industry insiders advised Elvis against recording it, fearing it would damage his image. Despite the criticism, the song reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 and has since been recognized as an important moment in Elvis's artistic development. Today, In the Ghetto is praised for its compassionate view of urban poverty, but at the time critics were not having it. Number 10, Moody Blue, 1976. Was Elvis past his prime in the mid-1970s? Critics certainly thought so when Moody Blue was released. One of Elvis's final singles before his death in 1977, Moody Blue, was lambasted by music journalists who felt Elvis was desperately chasing trends. The title track of his final studio album featured a contemporary country pop sound with light disco influences that critics found baffling coming from the former rock and roll revolutionary. Melody Maker called it a sad attempt to stay relevant in a musical landscape that had moved on. The Washington Post described it as the sound of an icon lost in the wilderness of changing tastes. Critics pointed to Elvis's voice, which had lost some of its former power, and accused him of merely going through the motions. Despite the harsh reviews, Moody Blue reached number 1 on the country charts and performed respectably on the pop charts. In retrospect, fans have come to appreciate the vulnerability in Elvis's performance, though the recording is still considered uneven by many Elvis scholars. Number 9. Way Down, 1977. Could anyone have guessed this would be Elvis's last single released during his lifetime? Way Down hit radio stations just weeks before Elvis's death, and critics were not kind. The song featured a funky groove that was intended to sound contemporary, but was deemed desperate and dated by reviewers. The vocal performance was criticized as being weak and lacking the energy that had defined Elvis's earlier work. Music critics pointed to the strained vocals as evidence that Elvis was in poor health and suggested he should have retired rather than continue recording. Billboard described it as a shadow of his former self, while the LA Times called it an embarrassing coda to a brilliant career. After Elvis's death, the single rocketed to number 1 in several countries, but this was largely attributed to the publicity surrounding his passing rather than the quality of the recording itself. Today, Way Down is viewed as a poignant final chapter of Elvis's recording career, though music historians still debate its artistic merits. Number 8, If You Love Me, Let Me Know, 1974. Did Elvis abandon his rock and roll roots? That was the criticism leveled at this country pop crossover attempt. When Elvis released his cover of Olivia Newton-John's hit, critics were bewildered by his choice of material. Music journalists accused Elvis of desperately chasing commercial success rather than staying true to his artistic vision. The arrangement was described as schmaltzy and overly commercial by several publications. Cream magazine mockingly referred to it as Elvis Goes Middle of the Road, suggesting he had completely surrendered his edge. Critics were particularly harsh about the lush orchestration and backing vocals, which they felt obscured Elvis's voice and personality. Despite the negative reviews, the single reached number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 and was more successful than many of his other mid-70s releases. In recent years, Elvis's willingness to experiment with different genres has been reevaluated, with some music historians praising his versatility. But at the time, this recording was considered a misstep by most critics. Number 7, My Way, 1977. Was it arrogant for Elvis to cover Frank Sinatra's signature song? Critics thought so. When Elvis released his version of My Way on the album Elvis in Concert, reviewers were merciless. They accused Elvis of hubris for taking on such an iconic song, particularly one so closely associated with Frank Sinatra. Elvis's dramatic, sometimes overwrought delivery was criticized as lacking the subtlety and sophistication of Sinatra's interpretation. The Guardian called it bombastic self-mythologizing at its worst, while other publications suggested Elvis was trying to craft his own obituary through the song's lyrics about facing the final curtain. Critics pointed to Elvis's strained vocals as evidence that he was no longer capable of delivering a nuanced performance. The live recording quality was also criticized, with some reviewers noting that Elvis seemed out of breath and uncomfortable on stage. Despite being panned at the time, Elvis's interpretation of My Way has developed a cult following among fans who appreciate its raw emotional honesty and view it as a moving farewell from an artist who sensed his own mortality. Number 6, The Sound of Your Cry, 1970. Did Elvis waste his talent on subpar material? Critics certainly thought so when The Sound of Your Cry was released as part of the That's the Way It Is album. This dramatic ballad was singled out by reviewers as an example of Elvis squandering his vocal abilities on mediocre songwriting. The lyrics were described as trite and melodramatic by by several publications. Critics were particularly harsh about the orchestral arrangement, which many felt was excessive and distracted from Elvis's performance. The New Musical Express called it a perfect example of everything wrong with Elvis's post-comeback direction, suggesting he had abandoned the raw energy of his early work in favor of overproduced adult contemporary music. Other reviewers noted that Elvis sounded uncomfortable with the material, forcing emotion that didn't come naturally. The song was largely forgotten after its release, overshadowed by more successful tracks from the same album. Today, even dedicated Elvis fans rarely mention "The Sound of Your Cry" when discussing his catalog, perhaps indicating that the critics were onto something in their initial assessment. Number 5. Kentucky Rain, 1970. How could a song now considered a classic be so misunderstood? When Kentucky Rain was released, critics were divided, with many questioning Elvis's artistic direction. The dramatic production by Felton Jarvis was described as overblown and excessive by several music journalists. Critics accused Elvis of shouting rather than singing during the song's climactic moments. The Rolling Stone review suggested that Elvis was compensating for uninspired material with volume and melodrama. Other publications criticized the song's narrative as cliched and questioned why Elvis was pursuing country pop rather than returning to his rock and roll roots. Eddie Rabbitt, who co-wrote the song later, revealed that several critics had contacted him expressing disappointment that he had given such an average composition to Elvis. Despite this initial criticism, Kentucky Rain reached number 16 on the Billboard Hot 100 and has since become a staple in Elvis's catalog. Modern listeners appreciate the atmospheric production and emotional intensity that critics once dismissed as excessive. Number 4. Burning Love, 1972. Would you believe Elvis's last major hit was initially criticized? When Burning Love was released, many critics viewed it as a desperate attempt to sound contemporary, though the song reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, making it Elvis's last top 10 hit during his lifetime. Reviewers were skeptical of Elvis's rock credibility in the age of Led Zeppelin and the Rolling Stones. Music journalists suggested Elvis was trying too hard to recapture his youth, with the Village Voice calling it an aging man's imitation of his younger self. Critics pointed to Elvis's slightly hoarse vocals as evidence that he could no longer deliver convincing rock and roll performances. The production was also criticized for being too slick compared to the raw energy of Elvis's 1950s recordings. Interestingly, Elvis himself reportedly disliked the song and was reluctant to record it, perhaps sensing the criticism that would follow. Despite the mixed critical reception, Burning Love has since been recognized as one of Elvis's strongest later recordings and remains popular with fans and on classic rock radio. Number 3. Trouble, 1975. Did Elvis still have what it takes to rock in the mid-70s? Critics weren't convinced when Tur You Be Lee was released. This up-tempo rock number was an attempt to recapture Elvis's rebellious energy, but reviewers saw it as an unconvincing performance from an artist past his prime. Music journalists noted that Elvis's voice sounded tired and strained, particularly on the higher notes. The arrangement was criticized for being too busy, with critics suggesting that the backing musicians were trying to compensate for Elvis's lackluster performance. Record World magazine described it as an uncomfortable reminder of how far Elvis had strayed from his revolutionary roots. Other publications questioned whether Elvis could credibly perform rock music while wearing jumpsuits and performing in Las Vegas. Despite reaching number 35 on the Billboard Hot 100, T. Lee was considered a commercial disappointment compared to Elvis's earlier successes. In recent years, some Elvis scholars have defended the recording, suggesting it showed Elvis was still willing to experiment rather than rely solely on ballads, but contemporary critics were largely unimpressed. Number 2, Guitar Man, 1981 remix. Can you tamper with a legend's work? Critics thought not when his posthumous remix was released. 4 years after Elvis's death, producer Felton Jarvis created a controversial remix of Guitar Man, originally recorded in 1967. The remix featured new backing, instrumentation, and arrangements that attempted to update Elvis's sound for the 1980s. Critics were outraged, accusing RCA Records of disrespecting Elvis's legacy. The Washington Post called it a grotesque desecration of a dead artist's work, while other publications used terms like cash grab and artistic vandalism. Music journalists argued that the new arrangements buried Elvis's vocal performance under trendy production techniques. Elvis fans organized protests outside RCA offices, demanding the label stop tampering with Elvis's original recordings. Despite the controversy, the remixed version of Guitar Man reached number 28 on the country charts, encouraging RCA to produce more posthumous remixes. Today, these remixes are largely viewed as products of their time and curiosities for collectors rather than essential parts of Elvis's artistic legacy. Number 1, Blue Christmas, 1957. Can you imagine Christmas without this song? Critics in 1957 certainly could. When Elvis first released Blue Christmas, reviewers were surprisingly harsh. The song, now considered a holiday standard, was criticized for bringing a sensual edge to Christmas music that many found inappropriate. Religious publications were particularly offended, with one calling it sacrilege set to music. Critics complained about Elvis's vocal delivery, describing his affected vocal trembling as exaggerated and almost parodic. The backing vocals by the Jordanaires, now considered an iconic part of the recording, were described as distracting and gimmicky by several publications. Music industry insiders predicted the song would be quickly forgotten after the holiday season. Instead, Blue Christmas has become one of the most recognized and beloved Christmas songs of all time, recorded by hundreds of artists and playing in constant rotation during the holiday season. The recording perfectly exemplifies how critical opinion can completely miss the mark on what will resonate with the public and stand the test of time. Do these critical missteps make you wonder how many other musical masterpieces were initially dismissed? Could today's critically panned songs be tomorrow's classics? Will future generations look back at our current musical judgments with the same bewilderment we now feel about those who dismissed Elvis?